April 9, 1943. Dawn. A thin, pale light was just beginning to seep through the low clouds hanging over the airfield near Krasnodar, turning the wet ground into a mirror of scattered reflections. Frost still clung to the edges of the taxiways, and the mixture of thawing earth, gasoline fumes, and burnt oil created a heavy smell that settled over everything like a second skin. The distant rumble of artillery drifted across the steppe, slow and rhythmic, as if the front itself were breathing somewhere beyond the horizon. Mechanics moved through swirling steam rising off buckets of boiling water, their breath white, their motions sharp from the morning cold. Metal clanged, engines coughed, and somewhere a starter whined for too long before falling silent under a frustrated curse. He walked toward his fighter with measured steps, boots sinking slightly into the softened mud. The aircraft waited in the dim light like a crouched predator, Bell P-39 Airacobra, olive drab streaked with grime, canopy beaded with dew, the thick mid-mounted fuselage giving it a strange, compact weight. He placed a gloved hand on the aircraft's nose, feeling the chill of the metal bite through leather. The cold was deceptive. Inside that metal skin lay the engine positioned behind the cockpit, a layout no Soviet fighter possessed, a configuration that promised both danger and possibility. The mechanics stepped aside as he approached, their expressions tense, their hands still glistening with fuel. They knew today's mission would not be simple reconnaissance. The Germans had been probing low along the Kuban Bend, sending Bf-109s to cut off Soviet ground attack units. Someone would have to meet them. A faint wind carried dust across the field, brushing against his coat as he climbed onto the wing root, the metal slick under his boots. The aircraft smelled of oil, canvas, and cold metal, an enclosed world, intimate and unforgiving. He lowered himself inside, hearing the canopy rails creak, and for a moment the sounds outside dimmed into a muffled hum. The field speakers crackled with orders, staticky and rushed. Pilots down the line were already strapping in, pulling harnesses over their shoulders, tapping instruments with impatient fingers. He rested his hand on the throttle, feeling the slight vibration of the airframe as the starter cart was brought forward. The ground crew chief leaned in, shouting something over the rising whine, but the pilot heard only fragments drowned by the engine preparing to awake. The Airacobra always felt different at this moment. The heavy prop, the delayed tremor as the Allison engine ignited behind his back, the momentary sensation of being caught between silence and power. When the engine finally roared to life, the entire cockpit shuddered, the canopy rattling as smoke drifted past the glass in twisting streams. He glanced toward the sky. Low clouds, flat light. Perfect altitude for a German ambush. Somewhere beyond that gray ceiling, the first enemy formation was already moving. And as he eased the throttle forward, the feeling settled in his chest. Quiet, but unmistakable. That today, the Airacobra would show whether it deserved the reputation others had thrown away.
He had been born in Novosibirsk, far from any front line, but the war had pulled him into the cockpit long before he had truly understood what flight meant. His name was Aleksei Voronov, 26 years old, Senior Lieutenant of the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. He was not one of those pilots whose names echoed across newspapers or whose portraits hung in headquarters corridors. His reputation was quieter, built not on grand speeches or reckless bravery, but on methodical discipline and a habit of surviving flights others never returned from. Mechanic crews respected him for his precision. Commanders valued him for his honesty. Fellow pilots trusted him because he never promised more than he could deliver. His first months of the war had been spent in the fragile, temperamental MiG-3, a sleek, fast machine at altitude, but a stubborn, unforgiving animal close to the ground. He had learned to fear its narrow landing gear and its tendency to punish even small mistakes. Later came the Yak-1, light and agile, but lacking the robustness needed for the brutal, low-level dogfights that dominated the Eastern Front. He had fought over Kharkiv, Voronezh, and the Caucasus. He had seen the sky filled with smoke and fire, watched friends spiral down trailing black oil, and felt the crushing guilt that came when the survivors walked back to the flight tents and counted how many chairs would stay empty at dinner. By the spring of 1943, he carried inside him a quiet exhaustion, a sense that the war's demands were endless and that every new aircraft brought its own disappointments. When he first heard they were receiving American Airacobras, he had reacted like most Soviet pilots, with cautious skepticism. The stories filtering through the front were contradictory. Western pilots claimed the machine was unstable. British reports declared it too dangerous at altitude. American instructors whispered that it spun unpredictably, killed trainees without warning, and belonged in training units, not combat. But Aleksei was not the kind of man to trust rumors. He touched machines, felt their balance, listened to engines as if they spoke a language only he understood. When he climbed into a P-39 for the first time, he noticed everything. The unusual weight distribution, the muffled hum of the engine behind his spine, the way the controls felt heavy yet responsive, firm but alive. It was not elegant like the Yak, not brutish like the LA-5. It was different, a machine with potential locked behind misunderstood engineering. What unsettled him most was the contradictions surrounding the aircraft. Why had the Americans dismissed it? Why had the British sent theirs back? Why did the Soviets, desperate and pragmatic, take every shipment eagerly, even requesting more? That tension pulled at him. He found himself studying American manuals at night by lantern light, tracing diagrams of the mid-engine layout, memorizing emergency procedures for spin recovery. He wanted to know why everyone else had failed with it, and a part of him, the part hardened by loss, wanted to prove that Soviet pilots could uncover strengths others had overlooked. Yet beneath his analytical calm, Aleksei carried a private fear, not of dying, that fear had dulled months ago, but of failing the men who flew beside him. Each aircraft he stepped into symbolized more than personal survival. It was the thin line protecting ground troops struggling below. He needed a machine that could climb fast enough, hit hard enough, and dive sharply enough to match his instincts. The Airacobra, foreign and strange, whispered that possibility. As he taxied toward the runway that morning, he tightened his harness and focused his breathing, sensing the weight of his decision. He would test this aircraft not in theory, not in training, but in real combat, against seasoned German pilots who would punish every weakness without mercy. And though he did not yet know it, the moment he lifted off today would decide whether he trusted the Airacobra with his life, or whether it would simply become another machine that buried its pilot's hopes in the smoking earth below.
By the spring of 1943, the skies of the Eastern Front were no longer a chaotic battleground of mismatched aircraft. They had become an arena shaped by doctrines, industrial choices, and illusions carried across oceans. What happened to the P-39 Airacobra before it reached the Soviet Union was not a story of poor engineering, but a cascade of misjudgments made thousands of kilometers away. Errors in expectation, not design. And as Aleksei Voronov climbed through the low clouds that morning, he was unknowingly entering a conflict defined by these earlier misunderstandings. The Americans had conceived the P-39 as a high-altitude interceptor, a machine meant to meet enemy bombers where the air thinned and temperatures plunged. The prototype had performed well with its turbocharger system intact, but production realities intervened. Factories struggled to maintain timely output, and maintenance crews complained about the sensitive turbo supercharger. Commanders, seeking simplicity, removed it entirely. The decision crippled the aircraft above 4,500 meters. Suddenly, the promised interceptor had no ceiling. At 7,000 meters, it gasped for power. Western pilots, as accustomed to vertical climbing attacks as they were to breathing, judged it harshly. In Britain, the disappointment was swift and unforgiving.
RAF squadrons found the Airacobra sluggish in the cold, thin air where Luftwaffe fighters roamed. Pilots reported poor climb rate, slow response in vertical maneuvers, and a troubling sense of heaviness during aggressive turns. After only a few months, the aircraft was withdrawn from frontline duty and relegated to training and coastal patrols. To the British, it had failed. In the Pacific, the Americans faced a different enemy and a different kind of failure. Japanese bombers operated high, often escorted by nimble Zero fighters. Lacking its turbo equipment, the P-39 struggled to intercept them. Missions ended with Japanese formations passing unchallenged overhead, while Airacobra pilots cursed their helplessness. Ground crews wrote bitter reports. Commanders concluded the machine was simply unsuited for real combat. Western doctrine demanded altitude, and at altitude, the P-39 suffered. Thus, the Airacobra gained its reputation: dangerous, unpredictable, insufficient. Western pilots saw a flaw where there was only mismatch. They expected a soaring eagle and received instead a low-altitude hunter with claws too heavy for thin air. The machine had been judged against a battlefield it had never been designed for. But in the Soviet Union, the war was a different creature altogether. Here, battles were fought at the altitude of smoke, 3,000 to 4,500 meters, where engines breathed deeply, where the Allison engine delivered full power, where its roll rate and stability in high-speed dives became terrifying advantages. Here, the Airacobra did not climb, it pounced. It did not chase bombers, it shredded fighters. And the Soviets did not insist on what the aircraft should have been. They explored what it was. Soviet mechanics, unburdened by American manuals and freed from British dogma, adjusted the aircraft with ruthless practicality. They modified radiators, replaced gun mountings, reinforced landing gear, added armor plates where needed, and ignored American warnings about engine limitations. When something broke, they rebuilt it. When something underperformed, they re-engineered it. And crucially, Soviet pilots received something they had long lacked: reliable radio communication. For a force used to hand signals and wing waggles, the Airacobra's radio transformed unit tactics overnight. Where Americans relied on vertical dives from the stratosphere, Soviet doctrine emphasized coordinated horizontal movement, mutual cover, echelon formations, and aggressive turn fighting. And the P-39, dismissed elsewhere, fit that doctrine perfectly. German pilots, accustomed to meeting fragile yaks or fast but brittle MiGs, suddenly encountered a foreign fighter that dove like a hammer, rolled with impossible speed, and delivered a 37mm shell capable of tearing an aircraft in half. Reports began filtering through Luftwaffe channels. Strange American fighters, deadly below 4,000 meters. Avoid prolonged turning engagements. A legend was beginning to form, quietly, almost accidentally. And as Aleksei climbed through the thinning morning haze, unaware of the transcontinental chain of miscalculations that had delivered this strange machine to his regiment, he was about to discover just how profoundly an aircraft's fate could change when placed in the hands of men who understood not what it should have been, but what it truly was.
The moment Aleksei leveled off above the river valley, feeling the Airacobra settle into its steady, dense hum, he understood the paradox at the heart of this aircraft. A paradox born not of engineering incompetence, but of a doctrine that had never matched the machine's instincts. The West had judged the P-39 through the lens of high-altitude combat, evaluating it against needs it had been stripped of the tools to fulfill. Without its turbocharger, its lungs were too weak for the heights. But down here, where the air was thicker, where clouds hung heavy over the Kuban fields and the German fighters swept in low to harass Soviet troops, the Airacobra felt like an entirely different animal. The Americans, shaped by years of expectation that fighters must dominate the stratosphere, clung to the belief that altitude was the throne upon which victory rested. Their doctrine demanded vertical climbs, long swooping dives from above, interceptions at levels where engines strained and metal moaned.
In that world, the P-39 stumbled. It wheezed its 6,000 meters, its rate of climb pitiful, its engine starved. Western pilots felt betrayed by a machine that could not mimic the P-38 or challenge the Bf-109 in the cold, thin heights of the Pacific or Europe. But the Soviets did not fight in that world. Here, battle was a turbulent, dust-filled chaos that hovered just above the treetops. Messerschmitts darted low to pick off attack aircraft. Stukas dropped screaming through thin clouds. Focke-Wulfs hunted ground units at barely a kilometer of altitude. And Soviet fighters met them not in elegant swoops from the heavens, but in vicious, close-quarter turning brawls, where reaction time, roll rate, and firepower mattered more than ceiling figures printed in manuals. Western commanders believed the aircraft was fatally flawed. Soviet pilots understood it was simply being used incorrectly. Still, the Airacobra carried genuine dangers, ones Aleksei could not ignore. The absence of the turbocharger, while advantageous at mid-altitudes, left the aircraft unable to escape vertically. A German fighter diving from above at high speed could pin a P-39 into a defensive turn where energy bled away, and if the pilot mishandled the controls, the nightmare began. The flat spin. A silent killer feared even by American instructors. The mid-engine layout combined with its center of gravity meant that if the aircraft entered a true flat spin, recovery was nearly impossible. The world would simply whirl horizontally, the cockpit rotating like a gyroscope, the ground rising with terrifying slowness until impact. Some pilots swore they could hear the Airacobra whisper during those spins, a metallic howl born from the airframe twisting under centrifugal force. Many Western trainees had never walked away from such episodes. Aleksei had read the warnings. He had memorized the emergency procedures, repeated the motions at night while his comrades slept, but he also knew something the Americans had never realized. Those spins most often came not from combat, but from pilot error. A panic pull on the stick, an unbalanced rudder in a desperate evasive maneuver, or a refusal to trust the aircraft's stability. The P-39 demanded discipline. It rewarded calm hands, and it punished fear. But that morning, as he banked southward and saw the flicker of sun on distant wings, German wings, that familiar tension gripped his chest. He understood that the real danger was neither the absent turbocharger nor the spin. It was the Western idea that the aircraft itself was at fault. Because doctrine had failed, the machine had been blamed. And now he, climbing alone into the same altitude band where the Airacobra finally came alive, was about to prove the truth of it. The fighter had never been broken, only misunderstood. Just ahead, the faint silhouettes of enemy fighters began to descend, their formation tightening, their intent unmistakable. The moment of confrontation approached, and the Airacobra hummed behind his back like a coiled spring waiting to be released.
The first warning came not from the radio, but from the glint, 3 brief flashes far ahead, sharp and cold like shards of broken glass cutting through the morning haze. Aleksei narrowed his eyes, instinctively easing the throttle forward. The Allison engine growled behind his back, the airframe trembling as the Airacobra surged ahead. Moments later, the radio crackled with static, then a strained voice cut through. Group of 3, altitude 2,000, heading east, looks like 109s. It was the confirmation he had expected. The Kuban airspace rarely stayed quiet past sunrise. He rolled slightly left, letting the sun slip behind his shoulder. Through the windscreen, the horizon wavered with heat and smoke drifting from distant artillery positions. And then he saw them clearly, 3 Bf-109s slicing low over the river bend, moving in a loose V formation, their bellies flashing silver as they banked. They were hunting, probably searching for Sturmovix or Yak-1s returning from night harassment missions. But instead they found him. Aleksei pushed the stick forward, dropping the nose. The Airacobra responded instantly, diving with a sudden heavy pull that pressed him into his seat. The engine roared deeper, vibrating through the cockpit floor. This was where the P-39 was strongest, in the dive, where gravity and power fused into a weapon. He felt it in the way the aircraft seemed to grip the air, not slicing through it like the yak, but punching down with the weight of a falling hammer. The Germans saw him too late. Their formation broke in panic, the lead 109 banking sharply right, the wingman snapping left, the third climbing desperately to gain altitude. But at this height, the Airacobra owned the sky. Aleksei centered the gun sight on the climbing fighter, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The 37mm cannon fired with a thundering jolt that shook the entire cockpit. The recoil felt like someone had kicked the spine of the aircraft. A single shell streaked forward and tore into the enemy fighter's radiator housing. A burst of black smoke erupted, followed by a flicker of flame. The Messerschmitt lurched violently, nose dipping, canopy glinting as the pilot fought the controls. Aleksei saw the aircraft roll onto its back, then spiral down trailing smoke. A swift, brutal kill. But there was no time to watch it fall. The second 109 swung behind him, diving hard. The sudden rattle of machine gun fire stitched across the left wingtip. Aleksei rolled right in an instant, the Airacobra flipping with a speed that surprised even him. The mid-engine balance made the aircraft pivot around its center of mass like a thrown knife. He felt the G-force clamp against his ribs, vision dimming slightly at the edges, but he held the turn, held the pressure, forcing the P-39 into a tight arc the Germans never expected. The German overshot. Aleksei leveled for half a heartbeat, pulled the nose up, and fired a short burst. The .50 caliber Browning spat flame, round smacking into the German wing root. The fighter jerked as if punched, but kept flying, trying to escape in a shallow dive. Aleksei followed. The dive steepened. The air thickened as they dropped lower, the treetops rising fast beneath them. The German pilot, desperate to shake him, pulled sharply into a climbing turn. It was a mistake, one that cost precious speed. Aleksei matched the turn, feeling the Airacobra's frame strain, the control stick resisting, vibrating under load. The cockpit smelled of heated metal and burning oil. The canopy glass quivered with the slipstream. For a moment, both aircraft hung suspended in the climb, engines howling in unison. Then the German stalled first. The 109's nose dropped abruptly. Aleksei needed no second invitation. He pressed the trigger again. The 37mm cannon thundered, the shell striking the German fighter square in the fuselage. It seemed to pause mid-air, as if shocked, then broke apart in a flash of flame and flying metal. Debris scattered across the sky in slow, tumbling arcs. Only one German remained. He was fleeing west, climbing weakly, smoke trailing from his exhaust. Through the haze, Aleksei could see him banking erratically, searching for altitude he could no longer gain. The Airacobra surged after him, the engine's rumble deepening into a confident roar. When he closed the distance, he noticed something unexpected. The German pilot wasn't turning to fight. He was running, abandoning the engagement entirely. Aleksei could have let him go. But this battle had already proven something vital. That the Airacobra was not the clumsy, doomed machine the West had discarded. It was fast, merciless, and entirely lethal in the environment it had been denied elsewhere. And now the final German pilot would learn that lesson too. He slid in behind the fleeing aircraft and fired one last burst. The German machine shuddered, dipped its nose, and descended into the smoke-stained horizon. The sky fell silent again. And as Aleksei eased the throttle back, breathing slowly, he felt it, the distinct electric certainty that something irreversible had just happened. The Airacobra had revealed its true nature, and word of this battle would spread.
When Aleksei returned to the airfield that afternoon, the sun already leaning toward the west, the ground crew gathered around his aircraft before he had even fully shut down the engine. Their expressions were half disbelief, half pride. The Airacobra's fuselage bore the scars of the fight, 2 bullet grooves across the left wing, a chipped edge along the spinner, and fragments of burned paint near the exhausts. But the machine had flown home with the calm solidity of a veteran warrior. Mechanics touched the metal almost reverently, as if feeling the heartbeat of something newly awakened. By the time Aleksei climbed down from the cockpit, the regiment commander had already been informed. 3 enemy fighters downed in a single engagement. Not luck, not accident. Proof. Proof that the P-39, dismissed elsewhere as unreliable and flawed, was in fact the perfect predator for the Eastern Front. The pilots listened in the debriefing tent with a mixture of quiet excitement and amazement. Words spread fast. The Cobra turns differently, dives faster, holds together under load, and that cannon decides the fight in one hit. And miles away, across Luftwaffe outposts, a different kind of message traveled from pilot to pilot. Avoid the low-altitude American fighters with the long nose and strange profile. They carry a heavy gun. They dive too fast. They fight too hard below the clouds. The Germans did not yet know the model designation. They simply called it Sotka, the 100, after the 100th Guards division markings many Soviet Cobras bore. The name stuck, and soon the mere mention of it in German briefings carried a shadow of hesitation. As the months passed, the transformation was unmistakable. Soviet aces multiplied on the P-39. Alexander Pokryshkin, Grigory Rechkolov, Dmitry Glenka, names that would echo across history, all mastered the Airacobra, turning it from an orphaned foreign machine into one of the deadliest tools of the Red Air Force. Pokryshkin refined tactics that matched the aircraft's strengths: aggressive diving attacks, horizontal maneuvering, radio-coordinated bookshelf formations that allowed entire squadrons to strike in 3-layered waves. Under his guidance, pilots exploited the Cobra's unmatched stability in high-speed dives and its devastating cannon. By 1944, the impact was undeniable. The Soviet Air Force no longer feared the low-altitude arena where German fighters once held dominance. On the contrary, those altitudes became the hunting grounds of the Airacobra. The balance of power shifted. German reconnaissance pilots noted the pattern with growing frustration. The Russians appear suddenly from below, gaining speed rapidly, impossible to outrun. And the legend grew stronger still when frontline units recorded a symbolic milestone. The final Luftwaffe aircraft shot down over Europe in May 1945 was destroyed by a Soviet pilot flying a P-39. The machine that Western commanders had abandoned ended the war with a closing strike. For Aleksei, the consequences were more personal. He flew dozens more missions, each strengthening his bond with the aircraft. He learned its voice, its warnings, its moods. He came to trust the low hum of the engine behind his back as one might trust an old comrade. And he understood something deeper, that the Airacobra had not changed from the moment it rolled off the American production line. Only the eyes that judged it had changed. The West had expected a high-altitude interceptor and discarded it when it failed that role. The Soviets expected nothing but survival and discovered a weapon perfectly suited for their battlefield. It was doctrine, not design, that had doomed the aircraft abroad. An understanding, not luck, that had turned it into a legend in the East. Years later, veterans would say the same quiet truth. The P-39 never needed to be fixed. The world simply needed to learn how to see it. As the day faded and Aleksei stood beside the cooling engine, watching the sun dip below the smoke-streaked horizon, he felt the weight of that truth settling inside him. The Airacobra had found its home not in the factories that built it, nor in the manuals that misunderstood it, but in the skies where it had finally been trusted for what it was. And with that, the story of the orphaned fighter was complete. An aircraft unchanged, a war changed around it, and a pilot who proved that even a discarded machine can become immortal when placed in the right hands.